WCLN 1170 Radio and Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you for being with us today. We Should Know is on the air. We're coming to you from Star Communications TV, Channel 16 and 316. Also, we're simulcast on WCLN Radio each and every week from Clinton, North Carolina, covering a large swath of southeastern North Carolina, multiple counties. And we appreciate those listeners and those viewers. Today, we're very excited to have with us Dr. Michael Walden. Dr. Walden is... he's one of these guys. It's going to take me just a moment to tell you a little bit about Dr. Walden, but he is a distinguished professor, William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor Emeritus at North Carolina State University, president of Walden Economic Consulting, 43 years on the faculty at NC State. He became recognized as an expert on the state economy and public affairs. And I'm going to underline most of that, Dr. Walden, as I'm going over your background. But you've authored 12 books and over 300 articles and reports, and you've made 3,000 plus personal appearances on the subject of economists. And you're a frequent contributor to national and state media. And a lot of folks know you from seeing you probably on some of the state media channels. I know you're a frequent flyer on WRAL. And oftentimes, even if you're not there, I notice you get referred to or kind of checked off on that Dr. Walden said. So you have that in your corner. The other thing that was interesting to me is you have 2 Champion Tuck Awards for excellence in broadcasting, the UNC Board of Governors Award for Excellence in Public Service, the Holiday Medal for Excellence from North Carolina State University, and the Order of the Longleaf Pine. I could probably go on, and I'm sure you were very conservative because there's a lot of other things probably that could be said here, but I want to quickly get to a couple of things that were really interesting to me. Is your newest book. It's called Real Solutions, which goes over a number of things. I'd like to touch on some of those. The other newer book is called Disunion, a political thriller, which I found fascinating. And I started trying to put characters in it for you when it goes to a movie. And a couple of other books is coming up, a relaunch on a book called How Families Can Be Renewed and the American Dream Revived in the New Independent Lifestyle of the Post-Pandemic Economy. And hopefully that'll be published in 2022. And the other part is that you're a member of the North Carolina Economic Development Association and you live in Raleigh with your wife, Mary. Something tells me Mary don't see you that much unless you're on TV. I don't know. Am I missing that?
Well, she sees more of me now that I've been retired and working at home. And she's been retired for about 15 years. She was a public school teacher, hardest job in the world, I think, teaching young people. She did that for 33 years. So we see each other now more, but we also respect each other's space. I think that's important if you're going to be retired and working, that you respect each other's space. So far, so good, though. We've enjoyed, apart from the virus going around, the pandemic, we've enjoyed being together more.
Well, I kind of feel where you're coming from. I did as well, retired 11 years ago and got into this broadcasting thing. And it's just been like the world. I needed something to do. And oftentimes I'm reminded with the question with no answer, I thought you were going to retire. And I think we can retire but not stop. Does that make sense?
Well, that makes sense. Yeah. But I emphasize that to people. I'm not a person who's going to be out on the golf course. In fact, I'd never played golf or sit at the beach or whatever. I need to be busy and hopefully constructive also. So, and I'm pretty much, I think, found the niche there in retirement.
Well, and to that conclusion, it's to our benefit that you have decided to do that, because we can use the brain thrust that you bring to us to better understand where we are in this world of economic, what it sometimes feels like, not only disorganization, but disaster. So let's start out with that. When we watch and we see things happening and we see a lot of need in the communities, and politicians will tell us, well, we're going to take care of that. And we see checks coming from different places and folks deciding for whatever reason that need has to be fulfilled. Where are we at in our stability of economy as it relates to governments and governments providing for society? Or do we need to look more at not other than governments to provide more for our society, i.e., faith-based organizations, industry, those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a big question. That might be the most important question that our society is facing today. Up until the 1930s, we had a system in our country, laissez-faire, free market economics, capitalism, whatever you want to call it, where essentially we let individuals do their thing, firms do their thing. If we had a recession, we had to have step up by faith-based organizations and charities, et cetera, to help people. The Great Recession of the 30s, though, was so deep that really overwhelmed those organizations. That was pretty much the first time we had the federal government come in and help people in institutions and businesses during the economic downturn. And that's stayed with us. So we now have a system where the federal government will be involved in recessions. We obviously had a big recession in 2020 with COVID-19. And I think we're going to talk more about this, but the federal government set a record for the amount of money that they pushed in the economy, almost $6 trillion to help a variety of people. And one of the concerns, of course, there is that effectively spent? How much waste is there? How much fraud is there, et cetera? So I think that's an ongoing issue. We're compassionate people. So when we have bad times, we want to help people, lift them up. We want to help them get on their feet, same with businesses. But on the other hand, we don't want to have a system where people rely on that and therefore they don't take their own initiatives. So that's a constant source of tension within our economy and within our government and within the entire populace. So what should be the role of government? How much should the government be involved in the economy, especially when the economy does go through these downturns, which we periodically do? And if we do have government programs, one of the things that we often don't do is go back and look at how effective they've been. We've already had some data come out, incidentally, on the amount of fraud that was in the PPP loans that went out in 2020 that helped businesses. So, yeah, these are all issues that I think are here now, and I think they're going to be here to stay.
Some numbers, you mentioned the fraud thing, and I may have been looking at an article that was skewed, but it seemed like I recall reading an article that the fraud was in the billions of dollars range, which was kind of astounding to me. But it goes back to, quote, the government. Is the government prepared to do the kinds of things it's trying to do?
Well, that, again, excellent question. You mentioned one of my books that I have out that came out, actually, I think now it's going on 2 years, about a year and a half, Real Solutions. That's a book that I wrote that sort of was the collective wisdom, if I have any, of 40 plus years of being in the academy. Well, thank you very much for that. And what I did is go through what I consider to be the major issues in the economy: income inequality, education, both K through 12, as well as college, healthcare, the environment, immigration, and talk about the issues, talk about what the key points were, talk about what other people have written about what to do, and then I added my own approach. Mm-hmm. So that's a book that if you want to get in, and I've been told that it's very easily read. It's not written for economists, really. It's written for people who are not economists. Mm-hmm. So these are big issues. I think in a lot of ways, oftentimes the federal government is very good about taxing money and then spending that money. They're not so good about tracking and seeing, well, did we really get our money's worth? So I think we're seeing that issue continuing. Those questions continue, especially with the COVID relief that's been pushed through in the last 3 years.
I think one of the interesting things to me was the poverty portion of the book. And you're exactly right. When you look at the book, and I hope folks will pick it up, and in all sincerity, it's an education piece where oftentimes I tell my audience, if I get this, anybody can get it. And I think you can look at that book and you're probably going to end up with questions, but they're going to be good questions. They're going to be questions that you can stage and questions that you can ask with some sense of clarity. But there's a lot about poverty that we have, I think, and I'm going to try to paraphrase here, so you tell me if I'm off page here, but it seems like we've tried to buy our way out of poverty rather than either educate our way out or work our way out.
I think I'll cut to the chase here in terms of my solution to poverty. And incidentally, we have made great progress in reducing the poverty rate. And things also, for example, like hunger. I think, unfortunately, there's a measurement of hunger, which isn't a traditional measurement where you're categorized as hungry if you literally don't have food. The question now that is addressed, well, how often do you think of food, and do you worry about not having food? And that, I think, gives much higher numbers. So anyway, I talk about all these on especially measuring poverty and hunger, et cetera. But I think the challenge, I mean, again, we're compassionate people. We don't want to see people on the sidewalk with no food, no clothing, no place to live. We're compassionate people. The trick is how to provide help to people, hopefully temporary help, without demotivating them from trying to help themselves. So I think the two have to go together. We don't want help to be permanent. We want it to be temporary. We all face temporary backslides. My late father was a carpenter all his life. Winter would come, he'd be laid off, and he would collect unemployment compensation. Then spring would come, and he'd go back to work. So there was a system there, but he was very motivated to try to do as much as he could for himself and his family. So that's the trick. We want to have a structure that does help when people need help, but does not take away from people, I think, the obligation that most of us think we have, and that is to prepare ourselves for the economy we live in. Prepare yourself to do something that businesses want to have done, and then you'll be remunerated for that, and you can go on with your life.
It's almost as though we need to plug in something in our social strata that it's an educational piece that educates folks of their role in this process of making sure that families and others, that we educate and teach people that, we teach them to drive on the right-hand side of the road. Certainly we ought to be able to say, look, you have certain responsibilities about your economic future and what the expectations are. And with that said, we're going to go to a break here in just a second. And I want to kind of, set the stage for this next segment. Now, I want to kind of follow along that trilogy of things that is in the book, Real Solutions. And I'm going to hold that up again so folks can see it. But each one of these talks about taxes, poverty, pollution, healthcare, immigration, college costs. A lot of folks is facing that. So let's touch on some of those when we come back. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. We're talking with none other than Dr. Michael Walden about the economy, your personal economy, about the economy of the country, and about what maybe sometime tomorrow may look like.
Let's get out of here.
Protect what matters most in your life with security from Star Communications.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We Should Know is on there. If you're driving down the road and just happen to tune in, we're talking with Michael Walden, Dr. Michael Walden, PhD, North Carolina State University, Professor Emeritus, author, I guess you could say author, broadcaster. You've done so much stuff. I could take the show up reading articles and talking about things that you have done, but I'm trying to focus on the world as we know it today and the economy in the world as we know it today. And a large portion of the state, as we were talking about on break, Dr. Walden, is for us, particularly in eastern North Carolina, east of 95, is a rural North Carolina, the same as it is in the western part of the state and a large portion of Piedmont. You know that better than anybody because you've worked the numbers out and crunched the numbers on what rural America does and the difference from that. Are we looking at a somewhat of a divide between our urban North Carolina and our rural North Carolina? And economically, what does that do to our economy?
Oh, there's no question there's been a divide, and it's been widened in the 21st century because what's happened in the 21st century, if you think about it, is more young people are going to college. That means they're looking for college level jobs. And you find a lot of those jobs, for example, in big metropolitan areas. So you've got the jobs, you've got the money, you've got the income in the big metropolitan areas. You've got the internet in the big metropolitan areas. And let's face it, although I will say in a minute how important agriculture and agribusiness is in North Carolina in terms of the percent of the workforce that's working there, it's very small. I think it's down to 1.5% of the workforce work as farmers. And we should actually celebrate that, because our farmers, we talk about all the tech revolution, and we talk about how more productive these big companies are becoming. If you cannot find an industry besides agriculture that has seen its productivity grow enormously over the decades, decade after decade. Both of my grandfathers were farmers in Ohio, and they were back in the era where you stood behind a horse or a mule and plowed the field. I mean, backbreaking work. And then we had mechanization come to the farm. And of course, now, if you go out to a farm in North Carolina, I mean, it is literally high tech. Farmers get their information about the weather from these instruments they have out there. It tells them what part of the field they should irrigate, what part they should not irrigate. So it's amazing. And yet we think it's a tiny part of our economy, but actually it's not. It's now, if you look at North Carolina's economy, we have an economy that's produces over $500 billion of products and services. Agriculture and agribusiness account for about almost $100 billion of that. So it's an amazing part. And we really should thank rural North Carolina for being so productive. I do see potentially some very positive changes for rural North Carolina coming down the way, because a lot of rural North Carolina, of course, they've got agriculture there, very important, but they want to diversify. And what's holding them back, of course, is high-speed internet. It's not widely available in a lot of our rural areas. I think that this pandemic has taught us that high-speed internet is as much a necessity today as electricity was for my grandparents over 100 years ago. So I think we'll eventually get it. And the other thing that rural North Carolina and small town North Carolina have going for them is, if you live in a big city like I do here in Raleigh, I'm just not very far from the state capital, for example, it's becoming increasingly expensive. If you didn't buy your home like I did 40 years ago, and we're trying to buy now, a lot of people, even if they got well paid, they just can't afford it. And then you've got the traffic, the congestion, et cetera. I think if we get high-speed internet in some of our beautiful, wonderful rural counties and small towns, North Carolina, and people can now remotely work in many cases, you'll see a lot of young people especially think, hey, I don't want to spend $500,000 for a house that I could buy in Kinston or Clinton for half of that. And I can still do my tech job remotely, and I can enjoy the open spaces and the fresh air, et cetera. So I think and this is actually what the book you alluded to called Relaunch, which is going to be out next month, talks about. I think we could see a real positive transformation in terms of bringing in more people, more spending, more economic power to rural North Carolina.
And I would be amiss if I didn't make a quick plug here for Star Communications and its efforts in plowing millions of dollars of fiber in the ground in the rural landscape here in Sampson, Bladen, and the counties that is serviced by Star Communications. Those cooperatives, as you know, and a lot of others in the state, have been key leaders in making sure that fiber gets there and that connectivity gets there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, another interesting situation to watch is that we have some very rich entrepreneurs, Elon Musk probably being the most prominent, who are looking at providing high-speed internet in a different way. Musk actually has a company called SpaceLink, which is in the process. This is not something on a drawing board. It's something he's actually doing. They're putting what are called low-orbiting satellites to circle the globe. And these would be much more efficient, much more high quality, reliable than the kind of satellite. If you do have satellite internet that's maybe 25,000 miles up in space, these are only 600 miles off the surface of the Earth. And so watch for this. Could be another game changer, that in those areas that have not yet been served by high-speed internet, with laying the cable or stringing the cable, as in my neighborhood, where they've not gotten to your place yet, this could be an option that could hurry this along.
Yeah, and I think the literature on those that Elon Musk and his organization is putting up, the key piece of that is the kind of the assurance of connectivity, that given certain kinds of inclinations of weather and that kind of thing, it may change their ability to connect. And various other things that happens in that layer of the atmosphere. So I think that's going to be a huge step forward, and I don't see any backing away from that. I understand there's several hundred up now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I would say by 2030, hopefully we will have reliable, high-speed internet available everywhere in North Carolina, and that could be a big game changer. Hopefully, mostly for the positive. I know in a lot of areas, people might say, "I don't want those urbanites coming into my neighborhood." But let's hopefully everyone will get along. But I think this could be a big game changer in the balance, shifting the balance in North Carolina, where really the growth has concentrated in the big metros. Raleigh, Charlotte, the Triad, down your neck of woods, Wilmington, et cetera. Really, that's really where the growth has been. It's where the big job growth has been. I think the last numbers that came out showed about 30 counties in North Carolina over the last 10 years actually depopulated. They lost population. And of course, if that happens, that the economy declines also. But I think we could see this turned around but we definitely have to have reliable, high-speed internet available in the rural areas.
I don't want to segue that since you've opened that door. I want to kind of touch base and get your thoughts on the idea of, quote, working from home and the availability of high-speed internet. The pandemic and what we've gone through to now seems to have thrust the future in our face, and we've moved forward rapidly, even faster than we could have imagined. And I'm hearing people say that companies now are listening to employees that say, well, look, I can turn out the same amount of work and not have to come in the office. You don't have to furnish me a desk, a space. And there's some serious discussion about that ingredients pool of what really makes a good employee. Is it the amount of time you spend from a certain period of time to another period of time, or is it the amount of product you put out?
Yeah. This has probably been the biggest game changer that's coming out of the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, 8% of the workforce worked remotely. And by work remotely, we mean at least twice a week, 2 times out of the work week that you were working remotely rather than going to the office. It was only 8%. At the height of the pandemic, which was around the spring of 2020, 60% of the workforce was working remotely. Wow. Now, as we've moved beyond the height of the pandemic, it's about half of that. It's around 30%. And many economists think that's probably where it's going to be. But even if that's the case, if it's 30%, I mean, that's more than 3 times what it was pre-pandemic. The surveys that have been done that I've seen suggest that what workers want is the option to work remotely. A lot of people they've missed the social interaction of being in the office, et cetera, but they want to have the option of working some days at home. This is going to be a big challenge for businesses. I look around Raleigh. If you drive down Hillsborough Street to the state capitol, we've got 20-story high-rises going up all along Hillsborough Street. If you haven't been down in the Raleigh recently, it'll just change your mind about what's happening. And a big question, of course, for those companies that are building the real estate is, will they get companies to move in? And obviously, they're betting on that. So there are going to be a lot of things to watch. But I do think working remotely is going to be a choice for more people. It's not for everyone, but for more people. And again, as I was saying in the previous segment, I think that could have very positive benefits for rural North Carolina, small town North Carolina. If you had, for example, a tech worker who, as I said, doesn't want to pay the real estate costs, doesn't want to deal with the commuting, doesn't want to have so many people that elbowing them as they go out to shop, et cetera. They want some more open spaces. This would be a perfect solution for them to buy a home in Sampson County, Lenoir County, Wayne County, and yet still be able to access their job, whether it's in Charlotte or in Raleigh, and everyone's happy.
And I think the other thing is that when I talk to folks that are developers, they're looking at potential of 50 miles more or less from Raleigh at the right location to interstates of putting in larger communities, as you pointed out, of homes that would cost $500,000 to $1 million in Raleigh that they can sell for $250,000, $300,000 with a golf course and a pool or something. And it just makes it, as you said, the tranquility is worth the distance in driving.
Oh, yeah. This book that I have coming out next month, Relaunch, I did some research into the impact of where you live. Do you live in a busy city or do you live in a rural area in terms of a person's psyche, in terms of their composure, in terms of their enjoyment of life? And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that if you live in a city and you have all that noise, you have all that interaction, you have all those elbows touching you, that if that's the daily grind every day, that does impact you negatively. And people need fresh air. They need space. So there are a lot of elements that go into this. And I think the next decade, I think this decade out to 2030 is just going to be a fascinating decade. I'm in my 70s now. I hope I'm going to live to see it, but I think we could see some big changes, and hopefully most of them for the positive.
We're going to take another break, and we'll be back in a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We're talking with Dr. Michael Walden. Very interesting discussion on economy.
Just because something may work doesn't mean it's right for your business. Let Star Communications' knowledgeable consultants help you customize a hosted voice system that's right for you. Our dedicated experts work with you to understand your business needs and guide you at every step, from choosing and installing services to ongoing maintenance and support. Contact Star today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Again, I want to thank you for being with us today. As you heard in our second segment, we're talking with Dr. Michael Walden. He's a professor emeritus from North Carolina State University, also Walden Economic Consulting, LLC. Spent a few years teaching people to understand economy and the economics of an economy, both in the public and private sector. Where we are now, and I think, again, I'm going to refer back to your book, Real Solutions. You've taken this book and put in that book specific things that are what I call bullet points for conversations in our society. And I've been just kind of going down that list. We just spoke to the issue of poverty. But one of the things that I found intriguing in like real time is this whole concept of pollution and what that means and what that is, and the cost factor of giving up one thing to look at another thing. Tell us how we should look at that and what the impact's going to be for us economically as individuals as we expect to transition from a world that is, should I say, less carbon than a world previously?
I think this actually segues very nicely into some of our previous comments about the role of government. Most people, I think, most scientists, physical scientists, say that the Earth is getting hotter and putting carbon into the atmosphere has some negative effects, and so we need to reduce that, or at least try to bend the curve, as they say. The big question is, who should do that? Should we have government mandates? Should we have government saying, all right, as I think the Biden administration is showing its hand on this, they're trying to forcibly move us away from carbon-based energy to so-called clean energy. And as we saw in Texas last year when they had a hard freeze, there's some issues in doing that too fast. We're seeing it in Germany now, where they have moved away from nuclear, and now they're at the they're subservient in some sense to the Russians, because the Russians are providing with natural gas. So one question is, who should manage that? If we all agree that eventually we're going to shift away from carbon-based energy to so-called clean energy, who should manage that? Should it be by government dictate, or should we let the market do it? Should we let people have their choices? And one way to approach this that I talk about in the book, and this is not originally with me, if the production of carbon, CO2, is negative for the environment, and when I get in my vehicle and I drive down the road, I'm emitting some carbon, I'm not directly paying for that cost. One thing to do is to say, well, if you're going to emit carbon, we're going to allow you, but you're going to pay a little cost for that. It wouldn't be tremendous, but you pay a little cost for that. And what that does in economics, when you pay for something, that's a signal, and how high that cost is tells you, maybe I should think better about this. Maybe I should not drive your vehicle, but maybe I should combine my trips. Maybe when I get in the mood to go to get a milkshake, I shouldn't just jump in the vehicle and drive to McDonald's to get a milkshake. I should combine that with other things, so I'm not driving as much. And so if you had to pay a fee based on your emission of carbon, that would be sending you that signal, and people would voluntarily move away from carbon-based energy to energy that doesn't have that kind of carbon tax. So I think that's the big question here. It's not that we don't want to worry about the environment, but that we want to say, how do we do this? To what extent do we want government's big hand to forcibly move us from one part to the other, or do we want us to do it voluntarily because we're getting financial signals to do that?
I think it's a good point. And another observation in that area is should government look at it as incentivizing it in such a way that you get some kind of incentive for purchasing or buying an electric vehicle versus a carbon vehicle, particularly as it relates to taxes. I mean, they've got a way to do that. Just, give you $7,000-8,000 to buy an electric vehicle versus buying that next vehicle and it being carbon. So I know these things have been discussed, and I'm sure you probably looked at these numbers. How realistic do you think it is for the government structure that we have now to really consider those things seriously? And when I look at the time element, just consideration of building the infrastructure for electric or EVs, as they're referred to, is going to be tremendous, the amount of time it takes just for people like you mentioned in rural areas.
Yeah. On your point about the incentivizing, yes, the government has tried that. We've had situations where in previous years where if you buy an EV vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, there you get a break on your taxes. Yeah, that's another way of doing it. The way I was presenting it was more of the stick rather than the carrot. But I think we also, and this may shock some people, one way of providing energy that many people have thought is, well, we're not even going to consider that, is nuclear. Nuclear is actually a clean energy. And of course, there were some problems 3 Mile Island here in our country. There was Chernobyl in Russia, for example. There was a problem in Japan not too many years ago. I mean, nuclear has gotten a bad rap because it's had some issues. But if you look at the track record of nuclear, it's actually very, very, very clean. And modern nuclear power is even cleaner and safer. So I think that it's a missed opportunity to say we're not going to include nuclear in this discussion. Because it is a way of providing a clean energy source. For example, France, I think, should be called on this, but I think France generates about 60% of its electricity from nuclear power. Now, Germany's gone the other way. Germany is closing all of their nuclear plants, but then they've shifted to natural gas. And who's going to supply them with the natural gas? It's the Russians. And we're seeing some of that play out right now. So I think this is another way where if government comes in and says, no, we're not going to do nuclear. No, you can't do that. That's, again, the heavy hand of government coming in and restricting our choices. And as long as you can produce nuclear cost effectively and reliably and safely, which on that final part, big strides have been made. I think at least it should be part of the mix.
I've got to kind of segue here. I'm probably not going to get through everything I want to talk to you about, but with that said, there seems to be a sense in our society now, and it's bubbling up in different places, that it's not a great thing to be extremely wealthy. That there's some problem with that, which I think was aired recently just in some of the major TV shows, in which at one time I think we had 75 billionaires. Now we're like 500 plus billionaires. I've always looked at that from my small world of understanding of economics to be a great thing. The more people that find wealth and grow in a capitalistic environment as a huge plus. But there's literally a growing number of people, and I don't have any data to back that up by any means, but just people that I talk to and hear are questioning, is that a bad thing? What should we understand about that?
Well, a couple of things here. This I think falls under the category income inequality. And when you mention income inequality to the average person, what they think has happened is the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poor. The rich have gotten rich because they're sort of somehow taking money away from the poor. That's not the case if you look at the data, and I have a graph in Real Solutions. What has happened over the last several decades is, yes, the rich have gotten richer, but so too have people who aren't rich. It's just they haven't increased their income as much as the rich. So the gap has widened, but it's not that people who aren't rich are going down. They're still going up. but just not as much. And the reason for that is that people who tend to be on the high income side of things are people who are doing jobs, occupations, they're building companies that are very valuable for the economy. I mean, look at Bill Gates. Why is Bill Gates so wealthy? Is it because did he steal the money? No, he developed software that most of us use to this day, and therefore he helped make the internet and personal computing available to more and more people, and so he's been rewarded for that. Now, Bill Gates is a very good example also of someone who has given back a lot of his wealth. He's a philanthropist, many different areas. So that's one of the things that I think is widely misunderstood. If someone is rich, a lot of people think, oh, well, they got rich illegally, or they got rich because they knew someone, or they've gotten rich because they've taken that money away from poor people. None of those on average tend to be true.
Yeah, and I think what we have to do more as educators, and I know you're still an educator, you'll be an educator the rest of your life, as will I. But at the end of the day, we've got to do a better job on educating people as to that piece. And I think media, and you're on a lot of media programs, I think media has a responsibility in allowing that window to be opened. I mean, they don't have to do it, but they got to open the window to educate people as opposed to just continuing to repeat that same soundbite, as you pointed out, that there's something wrong with people when they got so much.
And if you're worried about income inequality, the way to approach this, in my opinion, is to try to make sure that people who aren't rich or who are at the bottom tiers have the opportunity to maximize the value of their talents, whether that be through education, whether that be through entrepreneurship, simply working hard. And there, I think, is where I would put my focus to make sure that for example, young person does have the opportunity to pursue their dreams. Although I always would tell my advisees, pursue your dream, but have a backup plan in case your dream doesn't work out. But so it's not a matter of in my opinion, pulling the rich down. It's a matter of making sure we have that system in place where people who are at the lower end of the income scale can have an opportunity to move themselves up.
Absolutely. Raise that tide and it will lift the other boats as well. Right. But I don't want to see, and I guess I'm not really a fan of, for whatever reason, demonizing folks because they can afford, I don't care if it's a $12 million yacht or whatever, unless they're running a cartel, then we could talk something else about it. But people that are legitimately in a capitalistic environment challenge themselves to do that, I think is a great thing. So we're going to go to another break here. When we come back, I've got several things I want to touch on. It'll be our last segment, and hopefully we'll get some of those in. And again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. I want to remind you, we're talking with Dr. Michael Walden. Call a friend, tell them who's on the air. They get several opportunities to see this. So I'm hoping that we can touch a lot of people. And if nothing else, maybe we can stir a conversation a bit. Dr. Michael Walden will be back with us in just a moment as we go to break for our last segment coming up. And remember, real solutions.
To get the most out of your electronic devices, you need a strong internet connection and a protected home Wi-Fi network. You need high-speed internet from Star. Star has the fastest, most affordable high-speed internet service available for all your devices. We have no long-term contracts or high-pressure sales. Our service speaks for itself, and switching is hassle-free. We take care of everything with free installation from a local company. High-speed internet from Star. Internet at the speed of life.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We Should Know is on the air. My name is J.W. Simmons. I'm your host. We're coming to you from Star Communications Channel 16 and 316, also WCLN Radio simulcast. So if you're picking us up in your car, you're not seeing our guest today, who is Dr. Michael Walden. Dr. Walden, I want to thank you again for being here today. We're up on the last segment. I want to kind of open the door for you, but before I do, I want to mention your other book, and I want to just a quick question from that book. It's called A Political Thriller, and it's Disunion. And I'm going to hold this up so folks can see it. You got to get this book. This is obviously a fiction, but when I look at it and I read it, I had one particular thing struck me. I think it's chapter 8 of that book. So this guy, and again, this is just an interesting quote, but it's going to follow with a question. Sergeant Burrell said, "Madam Governor, I don't know exactly what it means. We've been informed the federal government just defaulted on the national debt." Mm-hmm. For some reason, that quote blew me away in that book. And here's my question. Is that something that could really happen?
Well, it could happen. And in fact, every time we have a debate in Congress about raising what's called the debt ceiling, and we had one of these a couple months ago, if that debt ceiling is not increased, technically we could default on the national debt. Meaning all that means is that the federal government would not be able to make the interest payments on the debt. That's something no government, just like no business or no individual, wants to do. It's possible. I don't think it's likely that will happen. I mean, there's some other issues with national debt that we talked about earlier, but I don't think it's likely to happen. And this was fiction, and it was
absolutely. I'll go back and yeah, exactly. I'll go back and reinforce that it is fiction. But if you do decide to buy that book, I'm just wondering. I'd like to have folks' feedback. If you do decide to get the book and read it, tell me what you think. Would that not make a great movie? I keep telling folks that I've looked at that book and it'll be an outstanding movie. So I'm just going to kind of let that go there. So at the end of the day, we're looking at everything has a cost. And, if the government decides, well, we're going to, you can order your COVID test and you're going to get X number of free COVID tests. We're going to give you this. Is there anything in our society that is truly, quote, free? Is somebody not paying for it somewhere?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Nothing is really free. That's right. There's always, even if you, let's say you want to go out and splurge and you want to buy a Maserati. And let's say you've got the income to do that. Let's say you spend $50,000 buying a Maserati. That's not something I would do, but that's just for the example. And you might say, well, the person had the money, bought the Maserati, they're happy. So what's the big deal? There is a cost to that, obviously the $50,000, but the real cost is what that person could have done alternatively with the $50,000. That's the way economists try to teach people to think. Always think about your options for using, let's say, any amount of money, or your time, for example.
So think about plurality of using money.
Yeah, and what you want to try to do over life is to use your time and your money in ways that give you the greatest return. And I don't want to make this hard and seem tedious, but just psychologically, that's the way I would tell people to have their thought process go on. And my wife, who was, as I mentioned, a public school teacher, not an economist, over the 4+ decades we've been married, she's actually come around because she had doubts about marrying an economist. I'll be honest with you. She thought of it as dismal science. But she's come around to think, you know what, those economic principles that you're always teaching, they actually make sense. And so when she is thinking about buying some big ticket item, she's actually thinking about buying a pickup truck now because she's a big gardener and she wants to haul dirt and so forth at age 71 around up and down the streets. But she's thinking about, all right, if I spend, let's just say $25,000 a pickup truck, I get the truck, but could I spend that $25,000 on something else that would make me happier? That's just the way economists recommend people think about their two major resources, money and time.
And the balance of that. How do you balance both?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One other thing, and again, I'm backing away from trying to toss things on the table, but another big issue and a cost value has been put on that, and depending on who you listen to, that cost value is different. But the whole issue of immigration continues to be ladled on the table. And again, I notice that is covered in this book. And this is not the fiction book, folks. This is the book that you've done the research on. I want to make sure I'm clear on both of those. So, but in this book, you speak to that. And just give us your thoughts on, there seems to be more emphasis in our media on the social impact of immigration versus the economic. And interesting enough, for agriculture, I'd hasten to say, and I'm not speaking for any farmers, but most of the farmers I talk to say if it were not for a lot of those folks that are here with green cards and others, that we'd be in real trouble.
Yeah. I don't think the issue is, should we have foreign immigration or not? I think most people think, yes, it makes sense for the country to allow foreign people to come in. I think the issue right now is we don't have control over it. we're having people come over pretty much unsupervised. And what I think we need to have ultimately would be, and this Congress would do this, is set some limit. How many immigrants do we want a year? 1 million, 2 million, whatever. And what kind of immigrants do we want? If we need, for example, we're lacking people in certain areas like truck drivers right now. There aren't a lot of truck drivers. Maybe we want to target people who want to come to this country who already are or could be good truck drivers. And actually, immigration has been important in keeping our country growing in terms of population. Most countries around the world are depopulating. They're actually declining in population because the birth rate is so low. And immigration is one of those reasons that the United States keeps growing. And in North Carolina, not only do we have foreign immigration, we have immigration from other states, people moving here to North Carolina from other states. I'm one of those. My wife is one of those. So I think the problem in my mind with immigration, foreign immigration today, is we don't have control over it. I think we need to have enforce a border, and we need to allow the people that we want to come in, and some of those could be political refugees. I understand that, but mostly we'd also want to make sure that people coming in have the skills or the potential to get the skills that are needed in our economy.
One of the things I think is interesting in that comment, I read an article recently where most countries have a protocol. And if you go to that country, they look at you and look at your background and look at your skill set, and you've got to have something that was going to contribute to that country. Right. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but I've never heard that discussed in our government here anywhere. It's just open the door. And even recently, I think it was obviously California comes in. I think it might have been San Francisco, but it was one of the cities that was doing away from you being a legal resident to vote. Mm-hmm. So you could automatically vote. It didn't matter. Just so you were living and breathing here, check here. You're in the country, so you can vote. And I found that a little disenfranchising.
Yeah, and I think I don't know the laws of New York State, but I think states can do that, and localities can do that. Yeah, and I think the other issue today is with so many people coming in on the border that we have no clue who they are and what they might be bringing. I mean, you worry about terrorists, you worry about criminals, et cetera, and which I think are certainly the minority of people who want to cross the border. I think most people who want to cross the border are probably on the path to be upstanding, productive people. But we don't know because we're having a hard time enforcing the border. So that would be step one that I would do. I would have Congress come up with a plan to say, all right, we are going to enforce the border, whether that means technology around the border, whether it be a wall like President Trump wanted to do, whatever, we're going to enforce the border. And then we're going to set a number of immigrants we're going to allow each year, 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, for example. And then thirdly, we're going to try to motivate people who can bring something to the country that the country needs. Not exclusive, this wouldn't have to apply to everyone, but at least some of the immigrants we want to bring skills to the country that we are in dire need of. Some have said, for example, that if you look at rural areas, there's a doctor shortage in most rural areas. This would be great to attract doctors from foreign countries to be able and make it part of the deal. If they come in and we allow them in, they go to a rural area that's underserved in terms of medical care.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've got about 2 minutes left, and I've got another thing I wanted to ask you, but I want to back off for a minute and just give you a minute to kind of conclude with something that we've missed that you know is a key point.
Well, what I'm mostly asked all the time is people want to know about the economy, where we're going for, say, the next 9 months or 10 months or whatever. I think we are in a very uncertain period. I think this has been reflected in the ups and downs in the stock market. And the issue right now is the economy has been growing. It's been stimulated with the $6 trillion the federal government's pushed in. Now we're paying for that with higher inflation, and the Federal Reserve looks like it's going to come in and try to slow things down, raising interest rates. So people should get ready for higher interest rates. And if the Federal Reserve overdoes it, we could have a recession at the end of the year.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And if you're looking to buy that house or get it refied, so to speak, you might want to do it now as opposed to waiting, because it might jump another, percent or even 2%.
Oh, yeah, I think 2 to 3 percentage points. Yeah. Which
is significant when you're looking at a home loan.
It would double the amount. Yes.
30 seconds. When you look at what's happening with the Ukraine, and we're looking at sending troops to another country, what does an economist, what's the feeling in your gut with that?
Well, what we look at, of course, are the economic implications. And I think part of the reason the stock market has trended downward is they're worried about that. And then, of course, energy. If you're in Europe, again, Russia is a big source of natural gas for a lot of companies. It's having impacts on energy. Probably we would pay for it if Russia did invade. We'd pay for it with higher oil prices. Hopefully, it won't come to that. But this is Russia's had issues for hundreds of years in terms of dealing with their neighbors, and they've often not played nicely.
Absolutely. Want to thank you for being with us, and we're coming up on our closure here today. And I'm reminding folks again of the book, Real Solutions. This is the factual piece. The research has been done on it. Great read. This is the one, folks, that I want you to look at. That's one of those books that I could see the movie. I started again putting the actors in. Disunion, and it's a political thriller. So I encourage you to take a look at those books. And Dr. Walden, again, thank you for being with us. And hopefully we'll get you back on and in your busy schedule as you're now retired. And seemingly, you would think you would maybe be fishing or something, but not. But thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to seeing you again next week right here. And as always, as we go to close, we always try to remind you, may God bless.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion regarding this or any episode, please send your emails to weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.